Lewis Hamilton wins his first race in Ferrari Red. Oscar Piastri secures his first pole in Formula One, and the gaps between the top teams are closing. We have a lot to talk about at this midway point of the race weekend as we head into what could be a very exciting race on Sunday in Shanghai. All coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. We are back for another race weekend, a very eventful weekend so far with a lot of fluctuations in performances with almost every car session to session. But I wanted to start with what we saw on Saturday during the sprint race where Lewis Hamilton took home his first race win as a Ferrari driver. Now, of course, he would much rather have a Sunday win over a Saturday win, but still a milestone achievement for him with his new team and a milestone achievement for him with his career, winning his first sprint race win of his career. But a very surprising result for Ferrari and for Lewis, considering what we saw from this team in Australia and even what we saw from this team in FP1 at the beginning of this weekend, where this car was just struggling. And it looked like a repeat of Australia, where they just didn't have the pace to keep up with the top teams. But credit to Ferrari and credit to Lewis for making the right setup changes in between free practice 1 and sprint qualifying, and really having this car dialed in for sprint qualifying, which allowed Lewis to secure pole and really put him in a prime position to win the sprint race. Now, it looks like this track in Shanghai is a track where clean air is just much more important than it is at other tracks. So getting out in front at the start of the race and getting into that clean air can pay huge dividends. And we saw that with Lewis, as he was able to get ahead of Verstappen at the start and hold him off really throughout the majority of the race until Max's tires started falling off. But even after that, I think it was lap 12 when Piastri eventually passed Verstappen for second. But even at that point, the Ferrari still had a very, very strong pace. And we saw that with Lewis finishing almost 7 seconds ahead of Oscar in second place. Now, we saw this with a lot of teams throughout the sprint race, but tire degradation was a huge factor in this race. And we'll probably see that trend continue into Sunday. But everyone's tires were falling off. But it looked like Lewis was in the best position, being out in front and being in clean air and not having that disadvantage of trailing a car behind him, which would kill his tires even more. And this was evident just looking at his teammate Charles Leclerc's sprint race result. Of course, he finishes in P4, but he finishes 12 seconds behind Lewis. Now, look, Lewis, it looks like he's had a better handle on this Ferrari than Charles throughout this weekend. But Charles is not 12 seconds slower than Lewis over the course of a 19-lap race. So a very strong indication of how hard it was for these cars to follow other cars and how much they struggled being in that dirty air, especially with their tires. But even with that, a P1 finish for Lewis and a P4 finish for Charles Leclerc was exactly what this team needed to give them the confidence to bounce back after a very tough weekend in Australia. As big of a story as it was, though, for Lewis to win the sprint race, it was equally as big to see the struggles of McLaren. Something that not a lot of people expected, where the McLaren, they did look fast at various times, and sometimes even the fastest car on track, but very, very unstable at times, which was very surprising considering how good they looked in Australia last weekend. The mini DRS controversy has reared its head again after Australia. The FIA came out, announced new regulations for this weekend, basically further clamping down on the flexibility of the rear wings. Now, of course, there was speculation this would hurt McLaren the most, as they've been the focus of this whole mini DRS saga. The team, of course, as you would expect, came out and refuted that, said, no, it's not going to affect us too much. But the way this car has struggled this weekend really makes you wonder if there was some truth to that speculation. It could be that the track just doesn't suit their car as well as we thought, but they had a very strong weekend here last year, so you really wouldn't expect that to be the main reason. But the middle sector has just seemed like a nightmare for both of these drivers, as they just can't get it right and can't get a fast sector at that part of the track. But also, in addition to that part of the track, turn 14, heading into sector 3, has been a huge problem for both of these drivers, and especially for Lando. He actually had a good chance of getting pole for the sprint race, but he just hasn't been able to get his braking points right heading into that turn all weekend long. And we saw that in his final run for sprint qualifying, where it looked like he had a chance to finish ahead of Lewis, but outbrake the car, went too deep into that corner, and really ruined his lap and bumped him down to P6 to start the race. Oscar was still able to qualify P3 for the sprint race, but not the result that you would expect for both of these drivers heading into this weekend after the strong performance last weekend. And this team, throughout the sprint race, was probably the best indicator for how important track position was during this race. Now, Oscar, starting in P3, he was able to stay at the front at the beginning of the race, and that really allowed him to keep up with the two front cars of Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen. And of course, he eventually passes Max and comes home with P2. Lando, on the other hand, starts P6 and has a terrible start, loses 3 positions on the first lap. Had that little moment where he dipped a tire off track and lost the car a little bit, which caused him to lose a couple positions there. But after that, it looked like that moment probably hurt his tires a little bit, and he just wasn't able to pass anybody. Eventually passes Lance Stroll for P8, but really, really struggled after that moment, and really struggled with his tires and just did not have the pace throughout the entirety of the sprint race. But he was able to finish P8, at least get 1 championship point out of the sprint race, but definitely a sprint race for him to forget. And Oscar, even having more pace than him, being out at front, coming home with that second place finish, still a surprising result, where throughout this sprint race, you're expecting Oscar to catch up to Lewis, catch up to Max much faster than he did, and it just didn't happen. Of course, it did happen with Max, but it didn't happen at all with him catching up to Lewis, and even the gap grew once Oscar got into second place. So a very, very surprising result in the sprint race for both of these McLaren drivers. But as the weekend has progressed, especially after qualifying for the race on Sunday, it became more apparent that McLaren just got the setup wrong for this sprint race. So a good indication and some hope for them as they continue into this weekend, but not the Saturday that this team was looking for. Another very strong performance, though, for Max Verstappen, but unfortunately for his teammate, another very underwhelming performance for Liam Lawson. Now, Max put himself in a great position for this sprint race, qualifying second. But importantly for him, it allowed him to stay at the front and to stay behind Lewis after the first lap and really keep up with Lewis throughout the majority of this race until his tires began to fall off. But that is still a huge problem for this team. We didn't see it in full force because of the length of the sprint race, but a big problem for them to watch out for as we head into Sunday. But this problem allowed Oscar to catch up to Max, eventually pass him for second. But Max still with a very strong performance, finishing in P3 and really outperforming the car based on the struggles that we've seen from this car. But on the other hand, another result for Liam Lawson to forget. And Max outperforming the car yet again made it even worse for him. Now, Lawson did have some good moments throughout the sprint race, made a lot of overtakes throughout the race, which we really didn't see from any other drivers. But P14 is still not the race result he wanted or the race result he needs with this team. And he really only has himself to blame for that. Qualifying last to start this race and putting himself with that disadvantage, starting at the back of the grid and just having all of that ground to make up. And as bad as that was alone, it gets even worse when you add in that Yuki Tsunoda finishes the sprint race P6. Uneventful race for him. Not a lot happened with Yuki, but finishing that high up the grid really turns the heat up even more for Liam Lawson's seat. A few final thoughts on the sprint race, but Mercedes with another solid performance. George Russell finishing P4, Kimi Antonelli finishing P7. Pretty uneventful sprint race for them, like it was for a lot of drivers and a lot of teams, but one they'll be happy with. Of course, they would have liked to finish a little bit higher, but these are the results that this team expects and should be able to produce on a consistent basis. And so far, with the dip that we've seen from McLaren, McLaren probably overall still looks like the strongest team, but you have to look at Mercedes as at least the most consistent team with their performances. But this car looks a lot more stable than it did last year, and we're not seeing the dips in performance from track to track that we saw last year from this team. So a very, very promising sign for Mercedes. All right, just a few quick thoughts on qualifying before we move to a race preview. Oscar Piastri finally secures his first pole in Formula One for an actual race on a Sunday. We almost had a McLaren front row lockout, but George Russell came in and stole that away from the team and from Lando with an incredible lap on his final run of Q3. But a big bounce back session for McLaren after a very disappointing sprint race. And it looks like they've corrected a lot of issues with the setups of both of these cars that plagued them at the beginning of this weekend. But a very good position for both of these drivers. Of course, they would have wanted a front row lockout like they had in Australia. But if Oscar can stay ahead of George and if Lando can get ahead of George on the first lap, both of these drivers will be in a very, very good position to not only control the pace, but save their tires as this race continues, which, as we saw in the sprint race, can be a very, very important factor. But a great qualifying performance from George Russell, and one that puts him in an excellent position for the race on Sunday. You never know what can happen at the start of the race, especially at a track like this where the first few corners are just so tricky and opens up for so many overtakes. But if George is able to get out in front and get ahead of Oscar and get ahead of Lando, that could really give him a huge advantage with his tires and allow him to control the pace for the rest of the grid. His teammate, Kimi Antonelli, not exactly where you want to see him. He qualifies P8. You'd like to see him a little higher than that. But again, he's still young. He's still learning the car, still learning these circuits. And you have seen some promise from him throughout this weekend where it gives you some hope that he'll be able to work his way up the grid. But it was a really weird qualifying with the performances of all the cars fluctuating from session to session. We did see a little mix-up in the order from what we saw in the sprint race, which tells you a lot of teams made a lot of changes with the setups of their cars in between the sprint race and qualifying. But it looks like McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, and at least Max Verstappen's Red Bull are really ahead of the rest of the grid. But the gaps are closing, which is very good news for us on Sunday and could make for a very competitive race on Sunday. But one of the biggest stories coming out of qualifying was Max's teammate Liam Lawson. Again, a very disappointing performance, qualifying dead last for Sunday's race. Big trouble for him, and not what he needed at all. The broadcast showed the footage, and Pierre Gasly might have messed up the start of Liam's final run, passing around him at the last minute, but it did look like Liam was just sitting there on track, probably for too long, trying to build a gap for his final run in between his car and the car in front of him. But you really can't blame Pierre for being stuck behind him and getting a little impatient and making that pass around him to start the lap. But regardless of that, it shouldn't have come down to that final lap for Liam. Even though he's not Max Verstappen, he should be much faster in this Red Bull car. And it's just not happening for him. The confidence just isn't there, and it seems like it's causing him to just not push this car to the limits. And is really causing him to lose a lot of speed and a lot of time throughout qualifying, free practice sessions, and even the race. But to make things worse for him, you have the two Racing Bulls in that Q1 session finishing second and third and ultimately making it all the way to Q3. But what have we seen from Liam in two races and one sprint race qualifying? He's qualified P18, P20, and P20. That just won't cut it with this team. And especially a team where Max is pushing this car to the front and securing podiums and top three qualifying performances. There's going to be a lot of pressure building on Liam, especially if Red Bull is in a position to compete for probably the Constructors' Championship. Don't know if they're going to compete for a Drivers' Championship, but the more that Max outperforms this car, the more pressure goes on to Liam, and he needs a huge Sunday to turn this around. But going to the Red Bull sister team, what a qualifying by the Racing Bulls. Isaac Hadjar qualifying P7, Yuki Tsunoda qualifying P9. A little surprised that Hadjar is already out qualifying Yuki 2 races in, especially after the disappointment from last week with him crashing the car on the formation lap and not even really racing. But the kid has talent, and he showed that today, and a huge bounce back from him from last weekend, and something that you like to see, especially for a rookie. But what we saw throughout the sprint race was how important qualifying positions can be for this track, and both of these drivers have put themselves in great positions to bring home points finishes on Sunday. A disappointing qualifying for Ferrari, though. Coming off of such a strong sprint race, you have Lewis qualifying in P5, Charles Leclerc qualifying in P6. I don't think they got it wrong with any setup changes on their own car. I think the other teams just corrected their setups enough to close the gap, but not where Ferrari wanted to be going into this race. And we saw it in the sprint race yesterday. The start will be very important for both of these drivers. An opportunity for them to get ahead, and if they can get ahead, will put them in a great position to make up some ground. But if they stay where they are, or if they even fall back and lose some positions on the start, could spell trouble for this team trying to work its way back up the grid and get a decent result out of this race. Last surprise coming out of qualifying for me, Alex Albon, again out qualifying his teammate Carlos Sainz for the second weekend in a row. Probably more surprising for Sainz that he's struggling this much, but it is still a new team for him, and he is still learning the car, where his teammate has been in this position, comfortable with this car and comfortable with this team for years now. But it seems like Williams has come back down to earth a little bit after last weekend, but qualifying P10 is still a very good result for Alex Albon and should put him in a very good position to score some points on Sunday. Finishing up with a race preview for Sunday. I don't think we're in store for an exciting race like we saw last weekend in Australia. And the biggest reason is it'll be a dry race. So we won't have rain showers popping up, causing crashes and surprise pit stops. But the good news is the field at the top looks like it has gotten a lot closer, which could make for a very, very exciting race. The other good news is teams don't know whether this will be a one-stop or a two-stop. No one has done any laps on the hard tires, so that is a huge question mark heading into this race. Now, I do expect teams will probably try for the one-stop, starting on mediums, switching to hards at some point, and then trying to make those hards last until the end of the race. But we saw in the sprint race just how quickly the medium tires fell off. And if the hards can't last 35, 40 laps, teams are going to be forced into a two-stop, which, as a fan, is probably what I'm hoping for. Two stops they always make things more exciting, and it adds more variety to race strategies and ultimately race results. So a lot of this will come down to tire degradation and exactly how long the mediums last, but more importantly, how long the hard tires last. My podium predictions, though, for the Chinese Grand Prix: in P3, I have Lewis Hamilton; in P2, Lando Norris; and in P1, taking home his first victory of the 2025 season, I have Oscar Piastri. I think as long as Oscar stays out in front on the start, he should be in an excellent position to hold that lead throughout the race. And of course, will be in the best position with his tires, but the start will be huge for his teammate, Lando Norris. As we saw in the sprint, if he messes up at the start and tumbles down the order, it could put him in a huge disadvantage with his tires and ultimately compromise his race. I don't think that'll happen. I think Lando will learn from Saturday, correct those issues. The setup of the car looks like it's better too. But I do expect Lando to have a good start and at least be in that top three coming out of the first lap. It will help him, I think, if he can get past the Mercedes of George Russell on that first lap. But even if he doesn't, I think Lando will still have the stronger pace to get ahead of that Mercedes at some point, and ultimately put him in that P2 position. But if he does do this pretty quickly, it could put him in a position where he's challenging Oscar for the race win. But a lot of this will come down to the race start. I do think you have to give Oscar the benefit of the doubt and give him the edge to win this race, though. He's just looked like the stronger McLaren driver for most of the weekend. And again, it looks like the team has corrected the setup issues, which plagued his teammate more, but also plagued Oscar in the sprint race and limited his ability to catch up to the front and become the lead car and get ahead of Lewis in that sprint race. But again, I think everything is in order for Oscar to really have a strong start to this race and put himself in a position to bring home the race win. I do think Ferrari will look strong. And again, I think Lewis will come away with that last podium. But I don't know if they're going to have the pace throughout a race to really challenge and really keep up with the McLarens. Now, the good news for them is they did have the strongest pace in the sprint race. And they were able to hold on to the tires much longer than other cars. And you would expect that to continue into Sunday as well. But the bad news for them is they're starting P5 and P6. We saw it with so many drivers in the sprint race, but if you don't get to the front at the start and you end up fighting through traffic, it can really ruin your tires and ultimately your race. So a lot for both of these Ferrari drivers will come down to the start. I do think Lewis will make his way up to P3 though, and I expect Leclerc to be somewhere close behind him, but I think by the time they work their way through traffic and up the grid, they've lost too much time to the McLarens up front and won't be able to really fight for a race win. I do think we see another strong performance from the Mercedes, somewhere in that P4 to P7 range that we're just accustomed to seeing them finish this season. I don't think they have enough, though, to really challenge with the McLarens or the Ferraris for a podium position. But George being in P2 for the start really puts him in a good spot. And if he can somehow get ahead of the McLarens and control that pace and get into clean air, we could see a surprise result from him somewhere in those podium positions. I do think we also see a strong start for Max. The Red Bull, though, is just, it's likely to fall off as this race goes on. Max has even alluded to it in his press conferences and interviews. Tire degradation is just too much of a problem for this team. And we started to see it in the sprint race, but we'll really see it over the course of a full race where even if he starts out strong, it's going to be a huge drop-off with the tires with this car, and will really compromise the race. But again, it's still Max Verstappen, so I do think we'll still see a strong finish from him, probably P5 to P6, somewhere in that range. But again, tires will be the nightmare of this car in this race. Going to the sister team, though, Racing Bulls, I think we are probably in store for a double points finish for both of them. Both drivers have just looked so strong all weekend, and this car is just fast around this circuit. But starting P7 for Isaac Hadjar, starting P9 for Yuki Tsunoda could be huge for both of these drivers, and it's especially really good, again, to see this bounce back performance by Isaac Hadjar after the disappointments of last weekend. Going to the last of the Red Bull drivers, though, and another one of his rookie counterparts, there is a lot of pressure on Liam Lawson, but also Jack Doohan, to get a decent race result coming out of this race. Of course, I think there's probably more pressure on Liam just being at a better team. But at the same time, all the rumors with Jack Doohan and only being secured for a certain number of races to start this season, both of these drivers have not put in the performances that they need, and we really need to see a bounce back performance by both. Liam, I think to take some of this pressure off, he needs to finish somewhere in the points. Now, it could be P8, P9, P10, but I think Red Bull needs to see him work his way up the field, similar to what he was doing in the sprint race, but make it all the way up into the points to really take some of that pressure off of him. Doohan, he doesn't necessarily need to finish in the points, I think, but he needs to get close, and we need to see some promise from him and some ability to really show some pace in this car and make some overtakes as this race continues on. But I think we are not as exciting as Australia was, but there will be some excitement in this race. But again, I think all signs are pointing to another McLaren 1-2, although it might be a little more close than we expected heading into this weekend. That's a wrap on today's episode. I appreciate everyone for tuning in and listening, whether it be Spotify or YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow, of course, with a race recap, hopefully an exciting one, but we will see how this all plays out with the start, tire strategy, pit strategy, and everything else that might pop up. Until next time.